Welcome back, everybody, to Philosophy for the People. I'm here again with Dr. Jim, and this marks the beginning of our series on Aristotle's Politics. Whoosh, awesome. Bang. Fantastic.
We've been threatening this for a long time.
Indeed, and the day has finally come. So, this is a natural extension of what we've done before, especially with Aristotle's ethics. In fact, that is really how this is supposed to go. You do the ethics and you go into the politics. So, if you missed our series on the ethics, we are going to insist that you go and revisit that.
I really highly recommend that. Yeah.
And, it's so important, Jim. I'm sure you'll agree with me. This is something that my professors, especially my master's program, always emphasize, and they're definitely right about this. It's like, look, you got to read the physics before the metaphysics. Otherwise, there's just going to be a lot of in the metaphysics you don't understand. Got to read the ethics before the politics. But you also have to read all this stuff, or at least a lot of it anyway, especially like physics and metaphysics, before you read Aquinas's De Ente, for example. Because all of that is just so much background knowledge that it's going to be hard to get an accurate interpretation or understanding of what's downstream if you haven't read what's upstream. Maybe you just want to say a few words about that before we dive in.
Yeah, I mean, it became very clear to me in teaching just a couple years ago how interconnected the culminating points of the ethics, the metaphysics, de anima, and the politics are, right? Or at least in the opening phases of the politics, right? And I think you really do have to see the ethics and the politics as, I mean, it's pretty clear about it. It's like semester one, semester two, right? So for how they're doing things. And there's certain moments in the metaphysics that I think if you haven't been through those, you have no idea really what's going on in book 10 of the ethic. And that came out, I believe, in our discussion of that book, on the podcast, right? And I think also, as you're going to see in the politics here, there's some polemical stuff aimed right at Plato's Republic in this too. So, once again, you're probably really not getting this unless you have the whole thing. And I think this is an important point about how one studies philosophy is it's the long game. It is the long game. You have to be patient with this and understand at every point in your development as like a scholar of philosophy, your understanding is provisional. Right. It is as well as you understand it at this point in your development, and you probably don't have it yet. Right.
Right. Spot on.
And I'll say this, like the Aristotle's Politics is kind of a weak point for me. Right. I mean, it's been a long time since I've sat down with this thing. As you know, I started reading it last year and just like, whoa, my gosh. This is probably the first time I've really taught it. Right. Okay, so for me, this is a great opportunity to up my Aristotelian understanding. Later in the game, right?
Yeah, fantastic. Very good. All right, so our plan today is to begin book 1. I think maybe go up to part or chapter 7. We'll see where we get. Of course, this is a series, so it will go on as long as it needs to until we get through the entire project. Excellent. So, let's not dawdle or delay. Professor, where do you want to begin?
What translation are you using? Just, I'm curious.
I have right now the one that I have up is the Hardy translation.
Cool.
But what is the one that I have around? Is it the Sachs translation? Yeah, I have a Sachs translation. Is there one that you recommend as well? Oh, did we lose? You froze up there for a second. Sorry, Jim, you're on mute now. You have to unmute yourself. Something happened with your mic.
Turn my mic and mute.
There we go.
Sorry about that. I got mutilated. Anyway, as you know, I have a boyish crush on CDC Reeve. So, so I'm using the Reeve, and I do recommend it. For nothing else, for the notes are incredible Reeve stuff. Sachs translations of Aristotle are interesting, and I've kind of wanted to discipline myself and go back through a bunch of Aristotle stuff using the Sachs translations. So I think those are recommended too.
Right. Yep. All right, groovy, man. Let's dive in.
Let's try that. I'm gonna kind of go through this in order. And my hope today is that we might get all the way up to chapter 7 of book 1. Okay. But very least we need to get through, I think, just to get a sense of what the project is through 1-3. Okay. So if you look at, I'm just going to read a little bit. I'm not going to spend all the time reading, but I'll read a little bit. So in the first paragraph in the Reeves of book 1, chapter 1, we get this. Since we see every city to be a sort of community and every community to be formed for the sake of some good, for everyone does every action for the sake of what seems to be good, clearly then, while every community aims at some good, the community that has the most control of all and encompasses all others aims both at the good that has the most control of all and does so to the highest degree. And this community is the one called the city, the community that is political. Okay. Now, a lot already going on there. He's hearkening back to the ethics where he discussed the good of the individual, right? Like you don't like the ethics is the preface to the politics, but really the politics is where it was going. And he actually says in the opening chapter of the ethics that the most controlling science is politics. Okay. Now I want to get clear here what Aristotle means by control. Okay, because it's going to be very, very important for how we think about his politics and how different it is from ours. Okay, so think back to or think up to the metaphysics. All right, and when Aristotle does see the God as the ruler of the universe, he uses like kingship governance metaphors for God's relationship to the rest of the universe. Okay, but you think of it, right, and you think of it, Aristotle says very clearly, the way the God runs things is by its inherent attractiveness to everything else.
Right.
Okay, so control for Aristotle, like we think of control, we automatically think point of bayonet, right? We think of control in a technological, efficient, causal way, right? For Aristotle, control is teleological.
Right. It's in the realm of final causality for him.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. And so like the community that is most controlling, or the science that is most controlling, is the one that is ordered to the good that is most attractive to the things under it. Okay. So what he's getting at here is what the political community is the community that it's most controlling among all of its sub-communities, all the way down to the human individual, because it is the one that secures the good that all those other communities are striving to get. You see that? Like, so for Aristotle, God doesn't run the universe by pushing things around. God runs the universe by showing up and just being so uber attractive that everything is just running towards it, right? Well, likewise, the political community controls all sub-communities down to the human individual, not by a kind of like pushing and pulling on things, but by making available the good, right? That they're all ordered to. Do you see that? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that's right off the bat is going to like how differently Aristotle's thinking about politics than we do. Like we think of politics in terms of like control in the sense of, how are we going to like push and pull people to get them going in the right direction, or how do people find a way to push and pull to get what they want, or something like that. Right. Aristotle already thinks of it in terms of this, like political control, political power is teleological in this sense that it is based on the natural attractiveness certain goods have to certain substances, right? And making provision for that.
Yeah, that's excellent. And certainly something we'll continue to do through this series is compare and contrast the sort of Aristotelian view of politics with the modern view. I mean, there's so many points of difference and departure. You've just highlighted one great one. Another is just the nature of the state in general, right? Is the state or the city, is it a natural entity, or is it a purely conventional, right? Or artificially constructed entity? You're going to see this is another great divide. But that's getting ahead a little bit. So, but I just want to point out that we're going to be trying to make these comparisons throughout, right?
And let's just look at, like, I won't read it, but let's go right into what, like, the next paragraph, because it's on that same point.
Right.
Is he's going to describe his method now, and Aristotle always starts out, well, some other guys always say, this is like Aristotle always goes, and these guys usually end up to be like kind of on the right track, but ultimately complete fools, right?
Right.
Okay. And so he says, these other guys, they think that the difference, so in paragraph 1, we've got a sense that there's a hierarchy of communities, right? There's the political community, and then there's some like sub hierarchies, and then we've already read the ethics, so we know this all goes down to the human individual. Okay. And they're ordered by goods. All right. And Aristotle next says, some people say the only difference between the levels is the domain, or the quantity of what they govern, right? So like political ruler or the king, right? That's at the top of the hierarchy because he's in charge of more stuff, like everything below him. He's like the highest genus.
But he's not different in kind from the household manager, for example.
Yeah, whereas the household manager, right, the head of the household, is just in charge of fewer people. But either way, it's the same thing that's going on there. Okay.
Right.
And Aristotle, wants to argue, that's not the case. That in fact, at each level of, although they're all ordered to the same ultimate good, each level has a distinctive kind of craft, right, that's going on there. So ruling yourself as an individual is going to be different than, say, running a household might be different from, say, running a village, might be different from running the polis. And the polis, the city, is the highest level Aristotle thinks is plausible. Okay.
And the difference in kind there is going to ground, I would say, differences in powers and authority as well, right? And what I want people to keep in mind with Aristotle's way of thinking about politics versus the modern way is actually the philosophical problem of political authority. Where does political authority find its grounding? Because most of us want to say that there is such a thing as political authority. We certainly act as if there is, but there are really great objections to the coherence of political authority, say from people like Michael Huemer. He's got a whole book on it. When it's constructed just from an entirely modern liberal paradigm. And what I want to say is Aristotle's got some really good resources to think through those problems. And in fact, his way of thinking through it might be the only way to ground political authority. Right.
Yeah. I'm glad you made that because I'm about to freak out on that in a couple chapters here. So
fantastic. Great.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm going to go crazy. All right. So last paragraph I want to look at in that first book, or in the first chapter, because I think it's very, very important for understanding the method here and Aristotle in general. Okay. So if you indulge me, I'll read it. All right.
Please. Yeah, it's short. Yeah, do it.
What I am saying will be clear if we investigate the matter in accord with the method of inquiry that has guided us elsewhere. So he's saying, I'm going to apply to the political compositions the same kind of analysis that I've applied to other kinds of compositions. Okay. For as in other cases, a composite must be analyzed until until we reach things that are in composite. Since these are the smallest parts of the whole, so too it is by investigating the parts of which a city is composed that we shall see better both how these differ from each other and whether or not it is possible to gain some craft-like expertise concerning each of the things we have mentioned. Okay. So what's Aristotle doing? It's like his general point. Like you could go back to the physics where he says, how do you really understand something? Well, you look at its principles, right? What are its principles? It is the parts of it that don't have parts. Okay. Parts in the broadest sense of part. Not literally, you can break it in pieces, but it could be just things that are distinguished conceptually. Right. And Aristotle thinks in as much as everything changes, there have to be parts of things. Right. Okay. You know what I mean? So like, in as much as something's mobile at the surface, it has to be immobile at a lower level. Right? But there has to be a diversity of the immobiles at the lower level to account for the dynamics at the top. Okay. Now, this is not to say at all that Aristotle's a reductionist. We're going to see this in a moment here. Okay. So he's not saying the state or the polis, the city, is nothing more than just a collection of its parts. Like Aristotle is one of the most emergentist thinkers you're going to find, right? So he thinks that the polis in and of itself, he's going to argue in a moment here, is prior to, in a metaphysical sense, all of its parts. But he does think we can only understand the polis by beginning from a bottom-up analysis. Okay. And if we do that, we will discover that by the necessity of his method, that all of these different parts and pieces play different roles in the composition. Otherwise, there'd be no distinguishing them. Do you see that?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's why you're not going to get like a single story of what leadership is or rulership is, for the individual, for the household, for the village, for the city. Do you see that?
Right. Yep. Yeah. And this is an important and recurring theme in Aristotle too. Go back to the metaphysics, for example, right? Where he'll talk about a finger, right? We only understand what a finger is in relation to the whole of the organism, right? He says a dead finger is a finger only in name only, right? So there's like different levels of priority depending on how we're analyzing a composite for Aristotle, which emphasizes, again, he is not a reductivist, right?
Yeah, and he's going to go to use that exact example that you mentioned, okay, right there. in book one. And think of it, so the finger is dependent on the body it's a finger of. Like, you cut my finger off, it immediately goes into decomposition. Okay. But note, if you want to understand how a human body works, you're going to have to understand how fingers work in their distinctiveness from the whole. Okay.
Yes. Right.
And that's the point he's making here. He's like, look, without saying all the body is a collection of pre-existing fingers and toes and livers and eyeballs, right? It's not. But still, if you want to understand how a body works or work a body, right, to learn how to use one, you're going to have to understand how each of those parts functions in a kind of isolation, right? And I think this is like people miss this, like Aristotle's brilliant way of missing or of not being a reductivist, but with also not like just granting things free floating autonomy from their parts too. Okay.
Right. Because the mere sum of the parts considered apart from the whole does not entail the fact of the actual whole, right?
Exactly.
Of the composite, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't gain intelligibility of the whole when looking at the specific parts, right?
Yeah. In fact, how else are you going to get it?
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's a very subtle but important way of analyzing things. Right.
I see chapters 1 and 2 of Aristotle's Politics as like the best summary of the whole system.
Yeah.
Right. Of the whole, at least his whole method.
It is all kind of right there, isn't it? Yeah. It's fun.
Okay. So if you go to the beginning of chapter 2, I just want to look at the text again there. He says, if we were to see how things grow naturally from the start, we would in this way, as in other cases, get the best theoretical grasp on them. First, then, those who are incapable. Well, let me stop right there at that sentence. So, note right there. This goes to a point you made earlier. For Aristotle, the state is not the state. The city, the political association, is not an artifact. It is a natural outgrowth.
Right.
He says, like, how are we going to understand? How are we going to understand the state? Well, we're going to have to look at its parts. Okay. How will we understand its parts now? Well, let's look at how they naturally grow. Okay. So this is not Lockean social contract theory. This is not Hobbesian social contract theory. We're in the beginning, right? There was no sort of human association, right? And who sat down and figured it out and put it all together by some sort of agreement? That's not happening here. He's saying he sees the human political association as just a natural outgrowth, as a flower blossoming, right? As the interaction of trees in a forest. This is just how they are, right?
Right.
And for Aristotle, like, there's no question of how you got the first one, because remember, like, the species are eternal. There's always been people here, and what do people do? We build cities, right? That's our thing. Okay,
that's what we're into.
Yeah, that's what we're into. Okay, so
now let me just highlight that, because it's. I mean, there are certain things that I think we want to acknowledge are right that often motivate the opposite perspective, that it's all a matter of convention, and that is like the form of government, or where we draw certain lines, or what positive law we make. Indeed, some of that is conventional, but that really just kind of springs from our rationality. But that we organize politically is indeed natural, right? Not a matter of convention, right? So it's almost hybrid in a sense, but it's definitely Aristotle's definitely right that the city is a natural thing, right?
And we should get this out on the table too right now, as where this book is going to go. I don't think Aristotle look at something like our political system, or the modern nation state, or maybe the oncoming global state, as in any way, shape, or form natural. Those are human artifacts.
Oh, he'd probably throw up. Yeah,
like you know what I mean. Like you're gonna see him argue here later in the book that he doesn't think you can have like geographically vast political organizations, right? It's not going to work out. It's going to become unnatural because there's not enough in common among the parts, right? Okay.
Yeah.
The
notion of a city or state, that in the way Aristotle's thinking it, in terms of its size compared to what we call a city or state today, is a ridiculous difference, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, like the city he's talking about is no bigger than Atchison, Kansas. Right. Okay. So like Waukesha would be a little big. Right.
Right.
Right. Okay. And so my point is like, just because Aristotle thinks politics is natural, it doesn't mean he sees our politics as natural. Right. I think he would see our politics as very unnatural. Okay. All right. So, can continuing on with Aristotle, he says, first, then, those who are capable of existing without each other necessarily form a couple. A female and a male do for the sake of procreation, as they do so they do not do so from deliberate choice, but like other animals and plants, because the urge to leave behind something of the same sort as themselves is natural. And as what rules by nature and what is by nature ruled do so for the sake of preservation. Okay, so let me hold there. So first of all, what is the start of human political association? It's sexual reproduction, right? Okay, so like now you have, like, as soon as you have sexually reproducing beings as opposed to asexual beings, one of the things that comes with that, all right, is the fact that you now have a kind of dependence on other beings, right? Asexually and independent reproducing beings are not dependent on each other. They just, they split and go, split and go, split and go. For us to fulfill our mission, right, we need another one of us, right? Okay, so it's interesting. So for Aristotle, the origin point of the political is sexual, right? It's sexual, right? It is.
Yeah, right. But not in the way that modernists think about it, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, not in like our infantile, truncated,
right.
Makes me
sexual liberation. Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, but I do think it's relevant to our discussion of all that.
Totally,
right? Is like there is no like the original, not temporally, but like in the deeper sense, the originary impulse of the political for Aristotle, right, is the human procreative sexual impulse.
Right, the procreative element. Yeah.
Okay. So then he says, so first you get people who need each other sexually, procreatively. Okay. And of course it's motivated by the twitching, but I mean, that's why the twitching's there. Yeah. Okay. Right. So you get people together who need each other sexually, but then he says, look, then also you're going to get, people are going to naturally be attracted in terms of what rules by nature and what is by nature ruled. Okay, for the sake of their preservation. Okay, I'm going to continue on here. For if something is capable of looking ahead by using its thought, it is by nature a ruler and by nature a master. Whereas whatever can labor by using its body is ruled and is by nature a slave. That is why the same thing is advantageous for both master and slave. Okay, so all right, so we might as well just get into this, right? Okay,
right. Because
I think people want to like make natural slavery as somehow like ancillary to Aristotle's politics. Okay, but it's not. I think you can see at the outset it's very central to what he's doing here. Okay, so so notice what he's saying here is what gets the political going is natural states of human dependency. Okay, first and foremost, sexual dependency. Secondly, there's a dependency of those who cannot rule themselves, right? And those who need others, right, to sort of prosecute their projects.
Right.
You see that? Okay. So first, note, like the master slavery is a kind of codependence. In the same way that sexuality is a kind of codependence. Okay. Now, note here that for Aristotle, a natural slave is something that is, or someone is that it is not capable, right, of looking ahead by using thought. Okay. So what Aristotle sees a natural slave as is somebody who cannot complete the project of the Nicomachean ethics.
Yeah.
Right. It's someone who in principle is not going to get full human practical rationality. Okay. All right. And of course, such an individual will need to be a dependent. Right. Do you see that? Okay.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Now, when we hear that, we think, okay, yeah. So, but what weren't like the majority of people in Athens? And it's not to say Aristotle is saying Athens is the greatest city, but it's an example, right? Weren't the majority of people in Athens or any Greek city-state, weren't they majority of them slaves? Okay. But yeah, it seems to us now that the people who are natural dependencies are going to be a very small part of, the developmentally disabled members of our population. Okay. Do you see that? Okay. And we also see, wouldn't it be wrong to like exploit them for labor? Okay. So I think that take is very naive. Okay. I think we are missing how different the situation is in, say, the ancient world even into the medieval world from what it is in the modern world.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And here's my point. Like, okay, I think no one who's read like Foucault's Discipline and Punishment can miss this point. Okay. Like the reason we can have the illusion that the majority of us are not natural dependents, right, is because we have all been subjected to now a nearly 2 decade, right, for each of our lives process of institutional discipline, right,
Right.
that
Mm-hmm.
basically runs our lives, right.
Mm-hmm.
So like you were like the reason there are like public schools is ultimately to discipline, right, the population, right. It's to habituate the population into the manners of behavior that keep order. That's what it really is. Okay.
Right. Is it to produce natural slaves, Jim?
It is to, I think, allow us the illusion that there are not natural slaves.
Ah, yes. Interesting.
You see what I mean?
Interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Right. So think of like ancient Athens. There's no like stop signs. There's no cops. Right.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, you know what I mean? There's no uniformed, like, the state isn't checking to make sure, your kids aren't being abused right there. I mean, think of all the ways that we are constantly like, there's no surveillance police state in the ancient world. Okay. Whereas we in modernity have always lived in a surveillance police state, right?
Mm-hmm.
Foucault calls it the carceral society, as in incarceration. In a sense, like the prison extends everywhere now. And I'm not taking a stance on this, but I think it's just true that we,
Mm-hmm.
like, our civilization is built on our ability to monitor and control and discipline the vast majority of the population.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we can say, oh no, man, like Aristotle just got human nature wrong. Like everybody basically, is a good self-governor and we can count on them to have practical rationality. No, that's not true. In fact, we spend.
Has anybody looked around for 5 minutes?
Yeah.
And do you like, as nice as that is to say, does anybody think that that's true?
Yeah.
Right?
And I don't just
that everybody's a good self-governor, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not saying like that's true and obvious just because of how badly people behave as soon as we pull back the veneer. That's okay. That's a thing too. But my point is just look at how much of the lives of the vast majority of the populace are under constant surveillance and control by institutions. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, my point is like, essentially, we are no different from Athens in this respect, that the vast majority of human beings are spending their lives under the tutelage of a system, right,
Mm-hmm.
that keeps them in line. Right. I mean, like, we're constantly bombarded with images and directions and instructions and
yes, of a ruler of some kind or another. Yeah. Right. And for Aristotle, it is or something like that. Yeah. And for Aristotle, it is the notion of rule. I mean, he brings it all the way back to the soul ruling over the body, and he just extends the notion of rule just sort of all the way up the chain. Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know what I'm saying is like pretty radical, but I'm not okay.
But is it wrong?
But does that make it wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think we can say, Aristotle, like this, he's got this elitist view where the majority of the population is not capable of self-government, and they need to be the dependencies of wiser people and stuff like that. And I said, well, that is absolutely no different from what we do, right? Mm-hmm. It's just we have a much more subtle, mechanical system of disciplinary control.
And does anybody think that that's any different from the way that our various elites actually think, right?
Yeah, no, it's not. I don't think it is at all, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. And so I know what I'm saying here is like most of like what we see is good in ameliorating modernity is just a grand put on. But guess what? I think it's a grand put on, right?
Indeed, right.
Okay, so there we are.
Yes,
right.
Bravo. Yes, well stated.
It's been good knowing you, Pat.
Here comes the cancellation, boys. Right? Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So more on this. All right. So So and then Aristotle goes on and says similar things about women here, and we're going to get into that when we get into the family. Okay. Mm-hmm. But I want us to see that, and we'll come back to natural slavery in a moment here. Okay. But I want us to, like, before we like get all worked up over that and make more of it than it is, I want, as you point out, like humanity is not over that, and may be impossible to be over that, because in fact, the majority of people probably do need to be governed in some way or other. Right. And we do the same thing. We just don't say it aloud, and we do it in like subtle, subversive institutional ways.
Mm,
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Good point. Good point.
All right. Now, so what he goes on through now, so he continues with the community, like the build up here. So like what happens? Like you've got natural dependency sexually, you have natural dependency between those who need to be governed and those who need, they need to extend their own projects more broadly to sort of provide the overall good, the master-slave relationship. Okay. You're going to have this now you're going to have, so what do you get there? What is a household? It's the sexual union of man and woman and their children with the master-slave union for Aristotle. Put those together in composition. Now you have a higher level of political order, which is the household.
Right.
Okay. Now, Aristotle goes on here to say, now look, households are not fully self-sufficient, right? They're going to have to depend on other households, okay, in order for them to flourish, right? So you're like, I'm good at growing corn, Pat's good at hunting deer, and we're going to need to like have trade, so we're going to like start combining households. So the household in and of itself is not a substance. It's like a finger. If you cut it off, it will rot, right? In the same way that a man alone is like a finger. No, it's not good that the man be alone. No wife, he's going to rot, right? But also like the man and the wife are no good unless they have the combination with the servant, the slaves. Okay. And same thing with slaves. But so no, none of these things are substances in and of themselves because they are not self-sufficient.
Yeah, right? Really important part. He's trying to identify what is the actual composite, the actual substance here. And his criteria is this sort of stands on its own, right?
Stands on its own. And once again, go back to the ethics. Like, what is the good life? It's the one most self-sufficient. And what does he mean by that, right? Well, it's not just that like you could have it all on your own. It's that it isn't dependent on goods external to it for its survival in a way, right? Or for its flourishing. Well, he's making the same kind of argument here, okay? All right, so then what he comes to then is like, look, you're going to have to like ban these households, right, into villages, but villages are going to be pretty flimsy on their own, so ultimately you're going to have the polis, the city, okay? And basically I think what he means by a city is something you could put a wall around. Right. Like you could plausibly put a wall around it. It has a definite boundary. But think of like, what's the difference between a living thing and a dead thing? Well, the living thing has a semi-permeable membrane, right? It is able to wall itself out into a self-contained metabolism, right? What is the city for Aristotle? It's something that can wall itself out into a self-contained metabolism, right? So you should think of the city for Aristotle on an analogy with the living cell, right? Okay. All right. Now, we get in here then, I think it's really important stuff for Aristotle is, I'm still in chapter 2 here. He says, from these considerations then, it is evident that a city is among the things that exist by nature, that a human is by nature a political animal, and that animal who is without a city, not by luck, but by nature, is either a wretch or else better than a human.
Right. It's a brute or a god. Right.
Yeah. Like the other Homer condemned, and like the one Homer condemns, he is, quote, clanless, lawless, and homeless. For someone with such a nature has at the same time an appetite for war, like an isolated piece in a game of checkers. So one, don't trust loners, right? So there's a reason why, right? But no, and we're just going to go on here to say, but for the human, it's pretty darn clear that we are in fact set up, designed for political life. Why? Because we speak, right? We have speech, okay? And he doesn't mean just sound making, okay? It's that, like, for Aristotle, speech and reason are inextricable, right?
Right.
Logos, it's the same word, right? Okay, we are the logos animal for Aristotle, okay? And when he goes on here, he says, look, other communal animals, right, have ways of signaling each other, right? Like, hey, look out, here comes the bear. Hey, look out, whatever, like bees squirting pheromones to the air and stuff like that. Like he knew bees could communicate, right? But he was also convinced they were deaf, though, because you couldn't train them. I love that. But he says with humans, we don't just communicate about like threat or pleasure and pain. We also can enter into deliberative discussions about what is true and good and just. Right. So interestingly, for humans, we're not just natural to community, right? we are natural to communities that put the very status of community into question.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's interesting. So like for Aristotle, what's distinctive with human beings is we're capable of something like the book, The Politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like Plato's Republic, that we can ask ourselves, what would be the best community? What would justice be? Okay. And deliberately come to a conclusion about that. Right. And Aristotle says, look, nature does nothing in vain. So if humans have this ability, right, it must be that we're suited to communities that foster the discussion of what is a worthwhile community.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Do you see that? Okay. And so then it's interesting. So like the kind of thing that he's doing in this book is integral to the actual kind of community he thinks has to happen, which I love that self-reference that's going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So then he goes on to say, look, in the next paragraph, and we've hinted at this, but it's really, really important, is he says, look, a human alone is a beast or a god. It's either less than a normal human or it's greater than a normal human, but it's not one of us, right? Mm-hmm. We are natural dependents, sexually, in terms of master slavery, in terms of the village, ultimately in terms of the city. Why? Because we are the political animal. Like we are the deliberately political animal, and therefore
Mm-hmm.
we can only do our thing if we have other people we can exchange with. Okay,
Right.
in logos we can
Mm-hmm.
exchange with. Okay, now okay, so that is his justification for the nature of the city, right? And why the different parts of it have both an independent and a dependency relationship. Do you see that? Okay. So then he goes on now in section 3 to say, okay, so now what we have to do is I've justified both the whole and the parts, and I've made you see that you can only really understand the whole by understanding the parts. Okay. The city is prior to the individual in the sense that the individual cannot exist without it. It's prior to the family, to the household, to the village, in the sense that those things are not self-sufficient. Okay. Mm-hmm. But yet that does not mean those things do not have upward effect on what the city is. Okay.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So now we have to have a craft knowledge of all those different structures. Like mm-hmm. What is the marriage? What is the mm-hmm. master-slave relationship? What is the acquisition of property? You're going to have to be able to make some money to make this thing
right,
run.
Right.
Uh-huh. And then ultimately, what is the overall constitution of the city? You see that? So he's going to do a bottom-up analysis to build up to the ultimate, like, overall controlling picture of the city. Okay. Mm-hmm. And he says, because it's the most controversial, I'm going to start with the master-slave relationship and what is the craft of mastering slavery. Right. Okay. And then we go into that discussion of mastering slavery that goes on for 4, 5, and 6. Okay.
Right. Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right. So do you want to do that now or do you want to save that?
What do you think? Because it really depends on how much time you want to spend on it.
Yeah. I don't mind if you go into it now. I've got momentum.
If the professor's ready, let's just get it done. Yeah. Okay, mm-hmm. So cool. I mean, you've already set the stage so much for it anyway. So
yeah, we set it up. Okay. So there's something mm-hmm. I want to know. All right. So what Aristotle begins by doing, I think this is really, really important and I'm not saying Aristotle's views of natural slavery have not been used to justify horrors. I'm not saying that hasn't happened. It has happened, right? But I do think that there's a significant distortion of those views that goes on.
Right. Okay? Yeah. And abuse does not negate proper use type of situation.
So what he does is he says, look, there are instruments that we have that we need to do our work, and some of them are animate and some of them are inanimate. Okay, so like a hammer, a tool, is an inanimate instrument. Okay, mm-hmm. And you could have an animate instrument, like he says your assistant is. Okay, so he has in mind here like a skilled craftsperson is like, okay, I could like hammer this in, or I could tell that like the boy who works for me, my apprentice, go hammer that in. Okay. Mm-hmm. And no, either way, like it's instrumentality all the way.
Right.
Okay. All right. And so, what he's basically saying here though, is like an instrument is something that is only valuable in terms of what it can produce distinct from itself. Okay. So he uses the example of the piece that you use in a loom to weave things together, a shuttle. Right. Mm-hmm. And he says the shuttle is only of instrumental value because you only want it in order to produce something else.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And he says your assistant is similar to that. Okay, right? Your assistant is a living instrument. Okay, you don't value it because of what it is, all right? Or so that you can you don't value just the act of telling your assistant what to do. You value the assistant simply because you need to get more done. Okay. And as soon as that productivity is gone, the assistant is no longer of value to you. Okay. So think of it this way, like that, like no, so that is how, like, in terms of like modern capitalism, we think about labor, right?
Yes.
Like labor is instrumental, and someone brings it in as much as it's useful, and it's only concerned about it until it's no longer useful, and then you would just discard it if you could.
Right. Time for layoffs. Yeah.
Okay. So Aristotle then says, so you can have something that's like instrumental, that's valued for its instrumentality, or you can have something that's valued for its action involving nature, is how Reeve translates it awkwardly. Okay. And so he says here, so like, whereas the shuttle for the loom, you only want that so you can get the rug out of it and sell it. Whereas a shirt or a bed, you want that so that you can use it. Right? You're not wearing your shirt to produce something else. You don't use your bed to produce something else. Like the activity, like the activity associated with the bed or the shirt is ordered to nothing beyond just the activity of the bed or the shirt, at least in terms of like your practical relationship to it. Okay. Do you see that? Okay. And so you don't see having your shirt or having your bed as a means to something else. It's just good to have one. Okay. And so Aristotle actually says a slave is not an instrument. It's an action involving piece of property. Do you see that? Okay. So he thinks the master is interested in the slave, as he's going to say here, as a part of himself. Okay. And the slave is interested in the master as a part of himself.
Right.
Okay? Not as just purely instrumental value. It's because they recognize that this is a natural relationship between us.
Yes. Right. Which is already a very stark difference from the notion of slavery that people rightfully are appalled by. Right. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Like, you know what I mean? And so, like, remember, and there's a sense of mutual dependency. Like the master is probably for someone who's not suited physically for certain types of labor, Aristotle will say, right? And the slave is for someone who's not suited for practical rationality. So what do? They depend on each other now. Okay. And there's a recognized codependence here. Like, they are parts of a whole. The master-slave relationship is an emergent whole based on the dependency relationship of its parts.
Yes, good.
Do you see that? Okay. So I think, though, like that right there, that distinguishes Aristotle and natural slavery radically from what we recognize as like chattel slavery, right?
Right.
And for Aristotle, you know, I don't know, maybe we'll see in the book what his actual views about like the buying and selling of slaves, right? But I just would not expect that that's going to sit well with him, because that's a natural relationship, right? It's any more than like buying and selling of wives was something he was not into, right?
Right.
Do you see that? Okay. And so the way he puts it in the text here is, from these considerations, it is clear that the nature and capacity of what the nature and capacity of a slave are. For anyone who, though human, is by nature not his own, but someone else's, is by nature a slave. So someone who can't govern themselves. And a human being is someone else's when, though human, he is a piece of property. And a piece of property is an instrument that is for action and separate from its owner. Okay, so all that is to say, and it sounds horrific to our ears, okay, but is to say that the slave is not a mere instrument, but an action involving instrument, right? It's something that the master actually values, right? Not as a further means, but as for the use that's in play there, and vice versa.
Right. And let me just say again, is this is always so important, is we have to, and this is not to say that there were beliefs of Aristotle that were not, by further reflection, say morally problematic or even deeply morally problematic. But for any thinker that we revisit, especially long after the fact, we always have to be careful that we're not importing our modern assumptions back into their thought, or interpreting them through our sort of modern lens of how terms are used or understandings of different notions, which is almost impossible not to do on some level some of the time, right? But if we're not aware of that and trying to understand Aristotle on Aristotle's terms, right? We could get things seriously wrong, and not just on moral ethical considerations, but physical ones, metaphysical ones, etc. I know this is a constant theme that we stress, but hopefully the example that we're giving right now shows exactly why that's so important, right?
Exactly. And once again, what's better if we admit that there is a distribution of human ability with respect to practical reason, okay, all right, then what's better, to treat the majority of the populace as things that we can train with the same kinds of methods that we would ultimately use to train lab rats, right? Or would it be to foster organic relations of mutual dependency?
Interesting thoughts, right?
And
Yes.
I'm not saying we're going to like go back to the good old days, and I'm not claiming they're good old days, but before we start throwing stones at this,
right?
Like do you want? Is it better that we have the minutia surveillance level of control through our mental health, physical health, police apparatus that we have to keep order, or would it be better to have people taking responsibility for other people that are more dependent?
Yeah.
Let that sit. Yeah.
Let that sit. Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So then another thing I want to hit this real quick is Aristotle in chapter 5. The question is, okay, so, some people think it's okay to take slaves through warfare. Okay. And I think this would imply whether or not you can go like buying them too. Okay. And is it okay just to enslave people that you have captured, right, in battle? And he says, Aristotle here says, hell no, it's not okay to do that, right? Because just because someone was on the losing side of a battle doesn't mean that they aren't personally, individually capable of self-government, right? And a slave is someone who's not capable of self-government. You could have Achilles could have been although he might not be the best example of practical reason. Odysseus could have been captured on the field of battle, right? Does that mean that he's not capable of self-governance? It doesn't mean that at all, right? And so if Aristotle is saying here is
right, it's not just who you can overpower, right?
Yeah, he actually says at this point is it's not the case that might makes right. Okay. It's only where these natural relations arise. Okay. Now he does say here, yeah, okay, this is going to really trouble us. He says you can usually spot a natural slave by looking at them, right? They're going to, maybe be kind of short and thick and have a sloping brow, like they look like me. Okay, right? And you can kind of spot a master, because they're going to be like more upright and maybe a little more effete, and okay. But he says,
is this why they're trying to cancel Aristotle?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. But he says here at the tail end of book 5, he says, but that's only for the most part. Okay. Now I'm not even saying it's for the most part, because here I am, like the most natural slave.
Aristotle takes one look at Jim, right? Yeah.
Take one look at Jim and say, yeah, get that guy back to the gym, right? Yeah. But anyway, but he does say, but that is always for the most part, and there are exceptions. He says the same thing about women too. Okay. So like Aristotle, like Plato, think of Plato in the Republic, is saying, look, whether or not what metal someone has in the soul, right? Aristotle says is something that is not, that you can't just pick out by appearance or even prior station in life. Okay.
Yeah.
That they're like, this is going to come down to like, what are the capabilities of specific individuals?
Okay. Right. Yeah.
Good. All right. Which once again, like I think, okay, although he does say, hey, in a jam, just look at him, you'll know. Okay. I'm not, that's bad. Okay. Right. But he is saying that, but that's just a rule of thumb. And in fact, like appearance could be deceptive about this.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And keep in mind his mentor, Plato, probably looked more like me than he did. Aristotle was known to like be
quite a gaudy individual.
Yeah, a bit of a dandy, right? He was an ostentatious dresser who wore a lot of jewelry and had skinny legs, right? I love that, right? Whereas Plato was known as shoulders, right? So clearly, like he knew people who looked like slaves but who weren't, right? And he is saying that this is going to depend, right? Okay, now another thing I want to point out before we wrap it up. This is in chapter 6, right? Let's see here. No, it's back in 5 yet. So when Aristotle says, okay, at the level of the city, okay, so the king, okay, or the political, like the absolute, whether it's the king and the legislative body, right? The way they will rule will be in the same way as he says the understanding should rule the passions.
Yeah.
Okay. And think back to like the Nicomachean Ethics and think back to the Republic. What that means is what they say goes, right? Okay. Because now you have to think of the understanding is externally related to the passions. These are different things, right? And there's not really this dependency relationship. It is command and obedience that has to be there. Okay. But then he says at the lower levels of political organization, it's more like the relationship between soul and body, not the body, but body. So what he means here is soul and matter. Okay. And now think of for Aristotle, soul and matter are mutually constituting. Right. Okay. The point of matter is to serve what the soul has to be. Okay. So the soul governs, but it doesn't govern it by external command. It governs through their mutual, right, like constitution. Do you see that? And so Aristotle says here is like so at the top level, yeah, you're gonna have reason commands passion. So like the king commands the city. Okay. I'm not asking, son, this is how it's gotta go. Okay?
Right.
For your own good, right? Okay. Whereas at the lower levels, in the village, in the neighborhood, basically, in the household, right, in the marriage, right, it's more as the soul is embedded in the matter, right? Okay, like do you see that? So it's not just external command, it's mutual constitution, right? But according to the order of the higher part, which would be the master or the husband or so
Right.
forth.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Very important distinction for what he's saying here about marriage and and slavery and all that, right? Is it's still about mutual constitution, right? Natural dependence, but one of these two things represents the final cause of the relationship.
Yes.
And thereby governs. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Really good. Really good.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not like you go and like you tell your wife what to do, or you just simply command your slave, right? The way you like the king commands his soldiers, right? It's more like, hey, where are we supposed to be going together, and I'm going to guide us in that direction.
Yes. Right. Good, man. All right. What else? Where are we up to now? Chapter 7.
Yeah, that probably takes us through chapter 7. So then we can get into chapter 8. We're going to get Aristotle on the acquisition of property, right? And where he will tell you, but the worst thing that can happen to you is that you get too rich.
Ooh, get ready. All right. Well, we will make that the kickoff for next time then. So we'll have part 2 of book 1.
Yep.
And man, this was good. I knew it would be. I always love doing these series, and we've got quite a catalog now here in philosophy for the people. I can't, of course, recommend enough to be completely self-serving and self-flattering. Our series on Plato's Republic. I thought that was just super tremendous, and of course, it's gonna be relevant for what we're doing here. So just for any newcomers or people that missed it before, please go get caught up on those other series. They're all here. They're all free on the channel, right?
And think of it like Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Ethics, Aristotle's Politics, and Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, which, as we found in reading that text together, Marcuse is actually reflectively very much an admirer of the Greek politics in many, many ways, right?
Indeed.
Even though he's a man of the radical left, right?
Right. Yeah. So do us a favor, guys. We've put these series together. We love doing it. We've gotten great feedback, and they're there. So help us grow them. Help us get more attention on them. If you guys wouldn't mind sharing what we're doing here, going back and sharing our Plato Republic, our Marcuse one, any of them, just email them, social media them, whatever, like them, comment. That stuff really helps this channel. And so if you like what we're doing, please consider supporting us in that way. We would really appreciate it. Jim, final thoughts and announcements before we go. I know you got a new Substack you wanted to mention too, right? Yep.
Yeah. I didn't get it up yet. So new Substack will be coming out later today. And it's the first of 3 that are going to constitute my introduction to philosophy.
Ooh, awesome.
Yeah. Which I think that might eventually evolve into an introductory to philosophy book. right? But yeah, so
nice.
the Substack follower will be treated to a draft of the first installment of that introduction to philosophy. So it'll be covering. It's going to cover the series is called Philosophy and Locality, and part 1 will be Hegel's understanding of philosophy.
Awesome. Well, I will. What I'll do is probably right after this, I'll put a comment under the video. I'll pin the comment. I'll link to your Substack. I'll link to my Substack, and I'll link to both of our Gumroad pay what you want courses. I've got 2 new courses that are going to be coming this month. One on composition, actually, and causality, and another on my sort of development of Haldane's prime thinker argument, which I think is a really neat thing. So, yeah. Jim and I both have courses on Gumroad. They're pay what you want, just another way to help support the channel. So we'll put all the links below. You guys can check all that stuff out. So until next time, gentle listeners, thanks.